Well, it's really a pleasure to be here, and what I thought I would do today is take you through some of the experiences that I've had as a scientist and an entrepreneur. I'm hoping to just talk for maybe half an hour-ish. I'll try to keep it to that, and then we can have the rest of the time for discussion. We can come back to some of Alexandra's questions that she posed. And I didn't really make this this presentation specific to being a female entrepreneur scientist. It's really very general, just about experiences. But I think you'll, a couple minutes into this, you'll think, she's kind of an outlier, which is very true. And I'm happy to talk later about maybe why I'm an outlier and why all these things kind of came to be. But I just want to talk you through kind of the process around some of the companies that I've been involved in starting, some of the highs, some of the lows, and really to get across a few key points about entrepreneurship really being a cycle. There's a start, there's a middle, sometimes there's an end, and then you kind of go back to the beginning and you keep going around and around. And if you're really wired like an entrepreneur, you may have times where you say, I want to get off this crazy train and just be, live a more normal life. But if you are wired as an entrepreneur, you will get back on the train eventually. And so that's part of the cycle and the phenotype of people that tend to do this kind of thing. So I'm just going to start with a couple quotes. I really like this one because people ask me all the time, like, Shana, I'm really interested in entrepreneurship. I'm really interested in doing very innovative research. I'm interested in commercializing, but I don't know where I'll ever find the ideas. And I have told many people over the years that the ideas are like the least of your problems. You'll have one, and then you'll have two, and then you'll have five, and then you'll have 10, and you'll have way more than you can ever work on. And so don't worry about the ideas. Try to find one that you think is half decent, and it'll lead you to many, many others. And then the other one is just about how this all happens. And, when startups get off the ground or there's an idea that could be a startup, it is never fully baked. And then once you do get off the ground, it is absolutely like building a plane as you're flying it, because there's all kinds of things that have to come together. And so these are just two things that I have found that have rung very true kind of throughout what I've done. Where I started on this journey, really comes to the area of diagnostic development. And this was an area that was highlighted for me pretty early on in my career. So I was trained as a chemist at Caltech, and not the kind of chemist that makes molecules, but the kind of chemist that measures molecules. And I did really very fundamental research as a PhD student. I'll tell you a little bit more about it. But then quickly started thinking about how we diagnose disease and how terrible we are at it. And this was quite a while ago. And we've learned very painfully over the last few years that when you can't diagnose disease quickly, on the spot, where you're able to do something about it, really bad things happen, right? Like during the pandemic, that was one of our major pain points. We just couldn't tell who was actually infected, who wasn't infected. We eventually came up with some half-decent tools that helped us, but we're still a long way away from where we need to go. And there's so many areas where this is incredibly important. Cancer, other types of infectious disease, the healthcare environment, how we monitor people that are taking drugs where there can be very adverse reactions. So many huge unmet needs. And, what occurred to me as I was first learning about this set of problems was just how enormous the instrumentation was that we use to diagnose disease. And as somebody who was doing a PhD in developing new technologies, and I knew from my experience in the lab how small things could be, if they were designed to be so. And, there was such an incredible divergence between the things that were really our mainstream tools, like these enormous instruments that sit in hospital labs or centralized labs, and then things like a glucometer, right, that were just incredibly miniaturized. And so I was trained as a chemist, but I actually think I was maybe born an engineer, because I've always thought about this very practical side of things and devices. And how do we make things smaller, better, faster, cheaper? And so when I first started thinking about these problems, it was just clear to me there was a lot to be done. So, where I first started thinking about this was as a graduate student at Caltech. And if you've ever been to Caltech, if you've ever studied at Caltech, this is it's just the epitome of the ivory tower. There aren't actually any towers. Everything's kind of low rise, but it's very quiet. It's very introspective, basic science, deep thinking about new ideas and ways to reframe, grand challenges in science. Some of the best years of my life at Caltech. It's just a wonderful, wonderful place. And the project that I worked on as a PhD student, and I should mention, just to kind of link back to the theme here today, I was very fortunate as a graduate student. I had an amazing female advisor, one of the 2 women in the chemistry department at Caltech. And that relationship that I had with that advisor, that's certainly part of why I'm an outlier. So I think that really resonates with the things that Alexandra talked about before me. So anyway, my advisor and I were working on a problem that was very fundamental in nature. So we had this question about DNA molecules. So if you start thinking about molecules as materials, and you looked at the structure of DNA, and you started thinking about electrons moving through DNA, there was just this fundamental question about whether they would move fast or slow. Could you think about DNA like a wire and a conductor, or is it more like an insulator? And you may be thinking, why does anyone want or need to know that? And there is no good reason. It was just at the time pure curiosity. And for some, especially chemists, we get into this kind of stuff. Physicists are even worse. We just come up with these questions that, we want to answer them because we ask them, and that's just how it goes. But we started, thinking about this question, came up with some ways to do it. I spent most of my PhD in the sub-basement of this building at Caltech that had no windows, no natural light. I was doing ultra-fast laser spectroscopy. Again, I loved every minute of it. But I could also tell at the same time this was not going to get me through the rest of my life to be doing this kind of work. But eventually, I transitioned over to a different kind of measurement system where instead of shooting DNA with lasers, we were attaching it to electrodes, to materials where we could kind of shoot electrons through the DNA from an electrode surface. And what we found, and this was purely accidental and serendipitous, that we could measure electrons flowing through DNA, and we thought DNA was kind of maybe not a conductor, not an insulator, but more like a semiconductor. And so we could measure the electrons moving, and then if we mismatch the bases, so we went from having a C with a G to, let's say, a C with an A, it turned the current off. And it was this very dramatic effect. And it just told us something about the way that the bases stack in DNA and their alignment and everything. And this will kind of date me, and you can probably make out the date on this patent. But at the time, it was not yet easy to sequence DNA. That was still being worked out. The methods we had were really kludgy. Lee Hood was right down the hall from us, and he was still kind of in the middle of working some of the chemistry out. There were others working on it. But being able to tell that there was a mutation in a sequence of DNA, we quickly realized that there was something that we could do with that. And we spent a lot of time kind of brainstorming, how are we going to do this? How are we going to make this work? And the beautiful thing about being at a place like Caltech that has an amazing tech transfer office, even though it's tiny, my advisor and I eventually, we walked down the hall. We didn't even tell him we were coming. We just said, hey, we want to talk to you about this patent that we're filing. And we explained it to him. We told him what we thought it could do. And he said, oh, that sounds really interesting. And again, this dates me, but he had a phone on his desk, and on his speed dial, he had Sequoia on 1 and Kleiner Perkins on 2, and just went down the list and had these 2-minute conversations with people yep, we've got this piece of IP, it sounds really interesting, you can do this or that, will you talk to Shana and Jackie and see if there's something there to get this out the door. Everybody took a meeting with us. 2 weeks later, we had a term sheet for a $5 million Series A. We pulled in somebody that was a lab mate of mine who I thought I kind of wanted to go to the academic route. He thought he wanted to go the industry route, and so we pulled him in. He was going to be kind of the day-to-day director of R&D, and we founded this company called Genome Sciences. So we got this company going. We had amazing investors. We had Eric Holmlin, who was our director of R&D, who was kind of the foundational person. And then, at the time, I didn't really know how incredible what was kind of going on around me was. Like, we were talking to every top tier VC in the US, and I was the one explaining the technology and kind of pitching them on how it would work and what a product might look like. And it was really just this incredible experience, as a 20-something-year-old, scientist, to see like the term sheet come and watch the negotiation of the term sheet and then watch how the technology got transferred into the company. And eventually I ended up with an academic position in Boston. The company was in San Diego. I just went back and forth every other week and, tried to get everything off the ground as needed. And then watch the company grow and really take off. And it was incredible. I mean, before I knew it, we had 10 people, and then 20 people, and then 30 people. And it was quite a tremendous thing to watch. And so originally what we did is we made basically well plates, like 96 well plates, that all had electrodes in them. And you could kind of bring your samples into that well plate to look for mutations. And the initial idea was that we were going to diagnose genetic diseases this way and do it fast and easy. Again, this is way before you could do sequencing the way you can do it now. And the company was making really good progress. We were doing beta trials, and things were getting really exciting. But this was also a learning experience for me that, the science very often goes one way, the business development group wants to go another way, and eventually you have to decide, right? Which you're going to listen to the scientists or the business development people. And if you're smart, you listen to the BD folks, right? If you want to be a company that makes money. So what was happening at the time was that we were all starting to freak out about what we now call healthcare associated infections, right? All of these superbugs were kind of coming on people's radar, things like methicillin resistant staph, and the rates of these things were kind of going up at this really scary rate. We now know this was like a little bit inflated and we were a bit hysterical about it, but at the same time, we really didn't have good ways to diagnose antibiotic resistant infections, and people were dying of these. So we decided as a company to kind of take a right turn and maybe think a little bit less about genetic diseases, more about these antibiotic resistant infections. We went out, we found a company that had a lot of IP in the area. We bought them, we kind of pulled their IP inside, and we had all kinds of plans to, run with this. We were gonna keep building our instruments, we were gonna put them in every hospital in the United States. But then along came one day an offer from Becton Dickinson to acquire this company. And of course, we spent a lot of time wringing our hands and like, oh, but we have all these great plans and everything. But, luckily the investors around the table were like, we do not walk away from an offer that looks like this. So we did go forward with the acquisition, and Genome Sciences became part of Becton Dickinson. But BD, went on to develop a whole suite of tools around the technology that they acquired from Genome. And that was also really fun to watch, to see, the Genome name kind of on these assays that were being used at very high volumes. And were expanded to include many other antibiotic-resistant infections. So this was kind of my first experience, and it was, really in many ways a very privileged experience because it went so well. And I now, in hindsight, have experienced things going, the story being different in a lot of different ways, and having this kind of first experience to kind of watch how you do things, watch how things can go right, was very, very formative for me.